The fluorescent lights in the principal's office buzzed overhead like angry wasps. Daniel sat in the hard plastic chair, his backpack at his feet, trying to make sense of what was happening. Just 2 hours ago, he'd been in calculus class working through problems on the board. Now he was here, accused of something he didn't do. Principal Wallace sat across from him, hands folded on the desk. The man had been at the school for 15 years, known for his strict rules and zero tolerance for anything that broke them. Behind him on the wall hung certificates and photos of him shaking hands with local politicians. Daniel had always thought Mr. Wallace was fair, maybe a bit tough, but fair. "Daniel, I'm going to ask you one more time," Mr. Wallace said, his voice low and steady. "Did you take the money from the fundraiser account?" "No, sir. I promise you I didn't," Daniel's voice cracked. He hated how scared he sounded, but he couldn't help it. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The principal slid a folder across the desk. Inside were printouts from the security cameras. Daniel stared at the grainy images. There was someone in the hallway outside the main office at 11:30 at night. The person wore jeans and a red hoodie. Daniel owned a red hoodie just like that one. He'd worn it to school dozens of times. "That's not me," Daniel said, his hands shaking as he held the photos. "I mean, yes, I have a hoodie like that, but I wasn't here that night. I was home studying for my chemistry test. Can anyone verify that?" Daniel thought back to that Tuesday night. His parents ran a small restaurant downtown. Tuesday was always busy because they had a special menu that brought in crowds. His mom and dad usually didn't get home until after midnight on Tuesdays. His older sister had moved out last year for college. He'd been alone. "No," he admitted quietly. "I was by myself." Mr. Wallace leaned back in his chair. The footage shows someone entering this wing at 11:28. The money was counted and locked in the safe at 6:15 that evening. You were one of the students who helped count it. You knew exactly how much was there and where it was kept. But I didn't take it. Why would I? Daniel felt tears burning in his eyes and blinked hard. He was 17, about to graduate, about to start his real life. He wasn't going to cry in the principal's office like a little kid. $5,000 is a lot of money, Mr. Wallace said. Maybe you needed it for something. College expenses, maybe? Daniel almost laughed, but it came out more like a choking sound. I have a full scholarship to Stanford, full ride. I don't need to steal money. Had a full scholarship, the principal corrected him. Stanford sent over their acceptance in January. But I imagine they'll want to know about this situation. The words hit Daniel like a punch to the stomach. Stanford. He'd worked for 4 years to get into that school. 4 years of late-night studying, of tutoring other students, of volunteering, of pushing himself harder than he'd ever thought possible. His parents had cried when the acceptance letter came. Happy tears. They'd both left their home country with nothing, built a life here from scratch, and their son was going to Stanford. Please, Daniel said, and he didn't care anymore if his voice shook. Please, Mr. Wallace, I didn't do this. I don't know who that is in the video, but it's not me. Can't you check something else? Fingerprints or something? The door handle was wiped clean. So was the safe. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. The principal opened another folder. I've called your parents. They're on their way. The next 30 minutes felt like hours. Daniel sat in silence while Mr. Wallace made phone calls and typed on his computer. When Daniel's parents finally arrived, his mother's face was pale with worry. His father looked confused and angry at the same time. The principal explained everything again. Showed them the footage, told them about the $5,000 missing from the account that was meant to help fund the senior class trip and buy new equipment for the computer lab. Daniel's mother spoke in rapid Mandarin, asking him question after question. He answered in English, telling her he didn't do it, begging her to believe him. His father stayed quiet, his jaw clenched tight. We will get lawyer, his father said finally, his English always a bit broken when he was stressed. Our son is good boy. He not steal. That's certainly you're right, Mr. Wallace said. But I need to make a decision about Daniel's status at this school. The evidence is quite clear, and our policy on theft is absolute. I've been principal here for 15 years and I've never made an exception to this rule. I won't start now. You're expelling me? Daniel felt the room spin. Before there's even an investigation? Before anyone proves anything? I'm expelling you because the evidence points to you, Daniel. I'm sorry, but I have to think about the other students, the integrity of this school. If I let this slide, what message does that send? Daniel's mother started crying. His father put his arm around her. then looked at the principal with eyes that held something Daniel had never seen before. Disappointment. Not in Daniel, but in the system they'd trusted, the country they'd believed would be fair to their son if he worked hard and followed the rules. The police came the next day. They asked the same questions, looked at the same footage, and ultimately said there wasn't enough evidence to charge him with a crime. The video was too grainy to make a positive identification. But that didn't matter to the school. That didn't matter to Stanford, who sent a letter revoking his acceptance. That didn't matter to the local newspaper, which ran a story about the theft with Daniel's name in it. Within a week, everyone in their small Ohio town knew. Daniel walked through the grocery store with his mother and felt people staring. His former friends stopped calling. The ones who did reach out asked him why he did it, what he'd needed the money for, as if his guilt was already decided. The worst part was that somewhere out there, someone had stolen $5,000 and let him take the fall for it. Someone had worn a hoodie like his, someone who knew the school layout, someone who knew he'd be an easy target. And that person was walking around free while Daniel's entire future crumbled. He stopped going out, stopped answering his phone. He spent his days in his room, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how his life had fallen apart so quickly. He'd done everything right, followed every rule, worked harder than almost anyone he knew, and none of it mattered. His parents tried to fight the expulsion, hired a lawyer with money they didn't really have, but the school board stood behind Principal Wallace's decision. The policy was clear. The evidence, circumstantial as it was, pointed to Daniel. Case closed. By the time graduation rolled around, Daniel wasn't there. He watched from his bedroom window as his former classmates threw their caps in the air, celebrated the end of high school and the beginning of everything else. He should have been with them. Should have been giving the valedictorian speech he'd worked so hard to earn the right to deliver. Instead, he was a thief. At least that's what everyone believed. And Daniel was learning a hard truth that would follow him for the next 20 years. Sometimes it doesn't matter what you actually did. It only matters what people think you did. And once that label sticks, it's almost impossible to peel off. 20 years is a long time to carry a lie on your shoulders. Long enough for the sharp pain of injustice to dull into a constant ache. Long enough to build a new life, even if it's not the one you dreamed of. Long enough to learn how to introduce yourself without mentioning where you went to college because you didn't. Daniel spent the first year after his expulsion working at his parents' restaurant. He washed dishes, prepped vegetables, took out trash. The work was honest and hard, and at least his parents never looked at him with doubt in their eyes. They knew their son, but he could see the sadness there too, the weight of watching their boy's dreams die. He tried community college for a semester but couldn't focus. Every time he walked across campus, he thought about Stanford. About the dorm room he'd never sleep in, the classes he'd never take, the future he'd never have. He dropped out after 4 months. Construction work came next. A family friend needed help on a job site, and Daniel discovered he was good with his hands. The work was physical enough that he couldn't think too much. By the end of each day, he was too tired to lie awake replaying that meeting in Principal Wallace's office. Years passed in a blur of lumber and drywall, of learning the trade from the ground up. Daniel was reliable, skilled, and kept his head down. By the time he was 30, he'd saved enough to start his own small contracting business. Nothing fancy, just him and a truck and whatever jobs he could pick up around the county. He stayed away from his hometown. Drove an extra 40 minutes to avoid passing through it on the way to job sites. His parents understood, even if it meant he visited them less often than he should have. Some wounds don't heal just because time passes. At 32, Daniel met Rita at a hardware store. She was buying supplies for a bookshelf she was building, asking the clerk questions about wood screws, and Daniel had stepped in to help. She had kind eyes and a laugh that made something in his chest relax for the first time in years. On their third date, he told her everything, about the accusation, the expulsion, the scholarship he'd lost. He'd learned by then that it was better to get it out early. Some people couldn't handle dating someone with that kind of story, and it was better to know up front. Rita had listened quietly, then asked, "Did you do it?" "No," Daniel said, meeting her eyes. "I swear to you I didn't." "Okay," she'd said simply. "Then that's all I need to know." They got married 2 years later in a small ceremony. Daniel's parents flew in, older now, his father's hair completely gray. His mother cried happy tears, and Daniel thought maybe this was his second chance. Maybe he could have a good life even if it wasn't the one he'd planned. Rita got pregnant when Daniel was 36. A daughter. They named her Lucy. When Daniel held her for the first time in the hospital, he made a silent promise. He would make sure she never experienced what he had. He would protect her from false accusations and rushed judgments and people who didn't care enough to find the truth. But that promise was harder to keep than he'd thought. When Lucy started kindergarten, Daniel couldn't bring himself to go to parent-teacher conferences. Rita went alone, came home with stories about Lucy's progress, about how she loved art class and was already reading at a second-grade level. Daniel listened and smiled, but he couldn't walk through those school hallways. Couldn't sit in those small chairs in those fluorescent-lit classrooms. "You should come next time," Rita said gently one evening after Lucy was in bed. She asked why you don't come with me. "I will," Daniel promised. But when the next conference came around, he found a reason to work late. The truth was, he was afraid. Afraid someone would recognize him. Afraid a teacher from his old school might have transferred to this district. Afraid that somehow, even after all these years, that label would follow him and stick to his daughter too. Rita was patient, but he could see the confusion in her eyes. She didn't understand how something from so long ago could still control him like this. And how could she? She hadn't lived through it. Hadn't felt what it was like to have everyone you know decide you're guilty before you even have a chance to defend yourself. Daniel started going to therapy when Lucy turned 7. Rita had suggested it more than once, and he'd always said no. But one night after Lucy's school play that he'd watched from the back of the auditorium, instead of sitting with the other parents, he realized he couldn't keep living like this. The therapist, Dr. Klein, was older, probably in her 60s, with gray hair and glasses that sat on a chain around her neck. She didn't push him to talk faster than he was ready. "It's called moral injury," she explained during their 5th session. "It happens when something deeply unfair occurs, when the world doesn't work the way you believed it should. It's common in soldiers who witness war crimes, in people who've been victims of institutional injustice. The trauma isn't just from what happened to you. It's from the shattering of your belief that good behavior and hard work will protect you." Daniel had never heard it put that way before, but it felt right. That was exactly what had broken inside him. Not just the loss of Stanford or his reputation, but the loss of his faith that the system would be fair if he played by the rules. Meanwhile, back in his hometown, Principal Wallace was being honored. Daniel's mother sent him a newspaper clipping in 2018. The old principal was retiring after 33 years in education. The article praised his unwavering commitment to integrity and discipline, and his no-nonsense approach to running a school. Daniel had stared at that article for a long time. The man who destroyed his life was being celebrated, was probably getting a gold watch and a pension and a retirement party where people gave speeches about what a great educator he'd been. Daniel crumpled the newspaper and threw it across his garage, then immediately felt childish for doing it. Rita found him sitting on the concrete floor an hour later, the balled-up article beside him. "He doesn't deserve that," Daniel said quietly. "He didn't even investigate. Just looked at some grainy footage and decided I was guilty. Ruined my life to make a point about his stupid zero-tolerance policy." "I know," Rita said, sitting down next to him. "It's not fair, and I'll never get an apology. Never get my name cleared. I'll die with people thinking I'm a thief." Rita took his hand. "The people who matter know the truth." But that was the thing. Daniel had learned over 20 years that the people who matter can't actually change what the world believes about you. His parents knew the truth. Rita knew the truth. Dr. Klein knew the truth. But that didn't change what the newspaper had printed back in 2003. Didn't change what his former classmates thought when they saw his name. Didn't change the fact that he'd never stepped foot on the Stanford campus except once, years later, as a tourist. Lucy grew up watching her father work himself to exhaustion. Watching him avoid school events. Watching him flinch sometimes when people asked where he went to college. She knew something had happened to him, something he didn't talk about, but she was too young to understand the full story. On Lucy's 10th birthday, Daniel finally told her. Sat her down and explained that when he was young, just a few years older than she was now, he'd been accused of something he didn't do. That sometimes life isn't fair and sometimes people make mistakes and sometimes those mistakes follow you for a really long time. Lucy had listened with wide eyes, then hugged him tight. "That's really sad, Dad," she'd said. "But I know you didn't do it." "How do you know?" Daniel asked, curious what she'd say. "Because you're my dad," Lucy said simply. "And my dad wouldn't steal." It was the kind of pure faith only a child could have, and it made Daniel's heart hurt in a way he couldn't quite name. He wished he could keep her from ever learning that sometimes faith isn't enough. That sometimes people you trust fail you. That sometimes the truth doesn't matter if everyone's already decided what they want to believe. Daniel turned 40 in 2023. Rita threw him a small party in their backyard. Just family and a few close friends from work. His parents came, frailer now, his mother needing a cane to walk. They sang happy birthday, ate cake, and Daniel thought about how different his life could have been. If that money hadn't been stolen. If someone hadn't worn a red hoodie like his. If Principal Wallace had investigated instead of just expelled him. If. He'd spent 20 years on those ifs. "You okay?" Rita asked later that night as they cleaned up. "Yeah," Daniel said, and he meant it mostly. He had a good wife, a great daughter, a business that paid the bills. He'd survived. That counted for something, but survival wasn't the same as justice. And Daniel had long ago accepted that justice was something he'd never get. Some wrongs don't get made right. Some stories don't get happy endings. You just learn to carry the weight and keep walking, or so he thought. Because 3 months after that birthday party, Daniel's phone rang with a job offer that would change everything. The old high school, the one he'd been expelled from, was being converted into a community center. And they needed a contractor. Daniel almost said no, almost hung up the phone and told them to find someone else. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a chance to face old ghosts. Maybe it was just the fact that it was a big job and he needed the money. "I'll do it," he heard himself say, and just like that, 20 years after being forced out of that building in shame, Daniel was going back. The first day back at the high school felt surreal. Daniel pulled his truck into the parking lot on a humid morning in July and just sat there for a minute. Engine running, air conditioning blasting. The building looked different. Older. The brick was weathered, some windows were boarded up, and the marquee out front that used to announce football games and honor roll students was blank. But it was still the same building. The one where he'd spent 4 years of his life. Where he'd eaten lunch in the cafeteria. Where he'd struggled through chemistry labs, where he'd walked across the stage at an award ceremony to receive a certificate for perfect attendance, where his life had fallen apart. "You going to sit out here all day, boss?" Daniel looked over to see Tommy, one of his crew guys, pulling up in his own truck. Tommy was young, maybe 25, didn't know anything about Daniel's past. That was nice sometimes, working with people who just saw him as the guy who signed their paychecks. "Just getting the lay of the land," Daniel said, killing his engine and climbing out. They walked the perimeter first, Daniel taking notes on what needed to be done. The renovation was extensive. They'd be tearing out old walls, updating the electrical, putting in new plumbing. The place had been empty for 2 years while the town fought over what to do with it. Finally, someone had gotten the idea to turn it into a community center. Meeting rooms, a gym, a space for local events. Daniel had a crew of 4 guys, including himself. They'd planned for the job to take about 3 months if everything went smoothly. Demo work always revealed surprises, though. Old buildings had a way of hiding problems behind their walls. The administrative wing was where they'd start. Most of the work there involved removing a maze of small offices and opening up the space into one large room for community meetings. The principal's office was in that section. Daniel had known it would be, had seen it on the blueprints, but somehow actually standing outside the door hit different. "This one's got some weird wall construction," Tommy said, knocking on the wall adjacent to what used to be the main office. "Hear that hollow sound? Might be a gap between walls. Old schools did that sometimes for running cables or pipes." Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Through that door 20 years ago, his life had changed. Part of him wanted to take a sledgehammer to the whole thing himself, just destroy it. But that was childish. It was just a building, just drywall and studs and electrical wire. They spent the first week clearing out old furniture and fixtures. Desks that had sat empty for years, filing cabinets with rusted drawers, ancient computers that probably hadn't worked since the 90s. Everything went into a dumpster out front. There was something satisfying about it, Daniel thought, taking apart the place piece by piece. On the second week, they started the real demolition. They'd pull the old drywall, check the studs and framing, then rebuild everything to current code. It was dusty, loud work, They wore masks and safety glasses and went home each night covered in white powder. Daniel was working on the wall adjacent to the old principal's office when Tommy called out. "Hey, boss, you're going to want to see this." Daniel set down his pry bar and walked over. Tommy had opened up a section of wall and was shining his flashlight into the gap. There was definitely space back there, maybe 8 inches deep, running the length of the wall. Probably for old wiring or heating ducts. "There's something in here," Tommy said. "Looks like a bag or something." Daniel's heart started beating faster, though he couldn't say why. "Can you reach it?" Tommy stretched his arm into the gap, grunting with effort.
Almost got it.
He pulled out a backpack, dusty and covered in cobwebs. The kind of backpack high school students carried. It had been blue once, but was faded and dirty now. They set it on the floor. Daniel stared at it, a strange feeling washing over him.
How long had that been in there?
Years, obviously. Maybe since the school was open. "Should we look inside?" Tommy asked. Daniel's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for the zipper. He pulled it open slowly. The first thing he saw made his stomach drop. Money. Stacks of bills, old and musty, but definitely money. "Holy crap," Tommy whispered. "How much is that?" Daniel didn't answer. He was looking at what else was in the bag. A student ID card, the edges yellowed with age. He picked it up carefully and read the name. Dylan Wallace. The room tilted. Daniel sat down hard on the dusty floor, the ID card still in his hand. Dylan Wallace. Principal Wallace's nephew. Daniel remembered him now, a year younger. Quarterback on the football team. Good-looking kid, popular. The kind of student who got away with being late to class or talking back to teachers because he had that golden boy shine. "You okay, boss?" Tommy looked concerned. "Yeah," Daniel said, though his voice sounded far away to his own ears. "There's more in here." He pulled out a notebook, the kind with a marble pattern on the cover that students used for everything. Daniel opened it carefully. The pages were filled with handwriting, entries dated like a journal. His eyes scanned the first page. Then the second. His hands started shaking harder. The entries were from 2003, from April and May of that year. Dylan writing about gambling, about owing money to some guys from a town over, about being scared, about needing $5,000 fast or they were going to hurt him. Daniel flipped through more pages. His breathing was getting faster. May 10th, 2003. "I have a plan. The fundraiser money. It's just sitting there in the safe. I know where Uncle Richard keeps the key. I can get in and out after hours. No one will know. May 12th, 2003. Did it last night. Took that kid Daniel's hoodie from the gym, lost and found. Wore it in case cameras caught anything. Daniel's got that Stanford thing anyway. He'll be fine. Me, I'm dead if I don't pay these guys." Daniel couldn't breathe right. The words were swimming in front of his eyes. He kept reading. May 13th, 2003. "They called Daniel in today. I felt kind of bad, but what was I supposed to do? Uncle Richard found out it was me. Recognized my walk on the security footage or something. He confronted me last night. I thought I was screwed. May 14th, 2003. Uncle Richard told me he'd handle it. He said Daniel was heading to Stanford, that he came from a stable family, that he'd land on his feet. Said I needed protecting more, that I had my whole life ahead of me and one mistake shouldn't ruin it. He said he'd make sure it pointed to Daniel, that he'd expel him, that it would blow over. I don't know. I feel sick about it. But Uncle Richard says it's the only way. The last entry was dated May 20th, 2003. Daniel got expelled today. Uncle Richard made it official. I saw him in the parking lot with his parents. His mom was crying. I almost went over to say something, but what would I say? Sorry I destroyed your life. Uncle Richard says I need to forget about it, move on, that Daniel will move on too. He gave me $2,000 back to help pay off my debts. Kept the rest to donate to the school so it wouldn't look suspicious. I'm supposed to put this bag somewhere no one will find it. There's a gap in the wall in the admin office. I'll hide it there. Daniel read the entry 3 times, then 4. The words didn't change. Dylan had stolen the money. Principal Wallace had known. Had covered it up. Had expelled Daniel anyway. Had protected his nephew and sacrificed an innocent kid to do it. 20 years. 20 years of carrying that accusation. 20 years of rebuilding his life from nothing. 20 years of avoiding his hometown. Of therapy, of explaining to his daughter why he couldn't go to school events. 20 years while Dylan Wallace walked free and Principal Wallace got honored as a great educator. Boss? Tommy's voice sounded very far away. "You're crying, man. What is it?" Daniel touched his face. His cheeks were wet. He hadn't even realized. "This is from 2003, Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "I was expelled from this school in 2003, accused of stealing $5,000. He held up the money. "This $5,000? Tommy's eyes went wide. "You're kidding. I didn't do it. I've been saying I didn't do it for 20 years. And this," he held up the journal. "This proves it. This proves who really did it and who covered it up." The next hour passed in a blur. Daniel called Rita first. Told her everything, his words tumbling over each other. She told him to call a lawyer. He did that next. Then he called the local police station and explained he had evidence related to a 20-year-old theft case. 2 officers arrived within 30 minutes. Daniel showed them everything. The backpack, the money, the ID card, the journal. They photographed everything, took statements, put it all in evidence bags. "We'll need to verify the authenticity of these items," one officer said. "Have them analyzed, check the dates, confirm the handwriting." "But this proves I was innocent," Daniel said. "Right? This proves it?" "It certainly supports your account of events from 2003, the officer said carefully. "We'll be investigating this thoroughly. The statute of limitations hasn't passed on the theft itself. And if this journal is authentic, we're potentially looking at fraud, evidence tampering, abuse of power." After the police left, Daniel just sat in his truck in the parking lot. Tommy had taken the crew home, said they'd pick up tomorrow. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty lot. This parking lot where he'd walked to his car that last day, where he'd sat while his mother cried and his father's face had gone hard and cold. His phone rang. "Rita, are you okay?" she asked. "I don't know," Daniel said honestly. "I spent 20 years thinking I'd never be able to prove it. And now you can," Rita finished. "Daniel, this is huge. This changes everything. Did it, though? It proved he was innocent, yes. But it didn't give him back those 20 years. Didn't get him into Stanford. Didn't undo all the times someone had looked at him with suspicion, all the jobs he hadn't gotten, all the nights he'd lain awake feeling the weight of that false accusation." "I need you to call the newspaper," Rita said. "Tell them what you found. This is news. People need to know." She was right. Daniel had spent 20 years hiding, staying quiet, trying to move on. But maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time for everyone to know the truth. He made the call. By the next morning, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. The local news had picked up the story. Then the regional news. By afternoon, it was going viral on social media. People from his high school class were reaching out, apologizing, saying they'd always wondered, saying they were sorry for doubting him. But the calls Daniel was waiting for didn't come. Not from Dylan Wallace, and not from the retired principal who'd covered it all up. Those calls would come eventually. But they wouldn't be apologies. They'd be explanations, justifications, denials, and Daniel was ready for them. After 20 years of silence, he finally had proof. The truth had been hiding in a wall all this time. Now it was time for everyone to see it. The story exploded faster than Daniel could have imagined. By the second day, news vans were parked outside his house. Reporters called his phone every 10 minutes. His email inbox filled with hundreds of messages from people he'd gone to school with. From total strangers, from lawyers offering to represent him, from victims of similar situations wanting to share their stories. Rita fielded most of the calls while Daniel sat at their kitchen table, still trying to process everything. Lucy came home from a friend's house and found her dad on the local news. "Dad?" She stared at the TV screen. "That's you. They're talking about you." Daniel muted the television and pulled his daughter into a hug. "Remember when I told you about what happened to me in high school? When I was accused of stealing?" Lucy nodded against his chest. "Well, I found proof that I didn't do it. Proof that someone else did and that the principal knew about it and blamed me anyway." Lucy pulled back to look at him. "So everyone's going to know you didn't do it now?" "Yeah," Daniel said and felt something crack open in his chest. "Everyone's going to know." The forensic analysis of the journal and backpack took a week. Experts confirmed the handwriting matched samples from Dylan Wallace's school records. The dates on the journal entries were authentic. The bills in the bag were from the right time period. Even the dust and cobwebs were analyzed to confirm how long the bag had been hidden in that wall. It was all real. Every word of it. The district attorney assigned to the case, a sharp-eyed woman named Peterson, called Daniel directly. "We're reopening the investigation into the 2003 theft, and we're looking into potential charges against both Dylan Wallace and the former principal. This is one of the clearest cases of misconduct I've ever seen." Daniel did his first television interview on a Thursday evening. The reporter was a local woman named Chen, who promised to tell the story fairly. They met at the high school, standing outside the building where it had all happened. "How does it feel," Chen asked, "to finally have proof after all these years?" Daniel had thought about this question a lot. "It feels like I can finally breathe," he said. "But it also feels like I lost 20 years of my life. Years I can't get back. What do you want people to know? That false accusations destroy lives, that zero-tolerance policies sound good on paper, but they don't leave room for actual investigation for truth. Principal Wallace decided I was guilty based on circumstantial evidence and his own desire to look tough. He didn't care that he was destroying a kid's future, and when he found out his own nephew did it, he cared more about protecting family than doing the right thing." The interview aired that night. By morning, it had been shared thousands of times. 3 days later, reporters tracked down Richard Wallace, the former principal. He was 75 now, living in a retirement community about an hour from town. The footage of him being confronted on his front lawn spread across the internet within hours. "Mr. Wallace, what do you have to say about the journal found in the school?" The old man looked smaller than Daniel remembered. His hair was completely white, his shoulders stooped. "I acted on the evidence available to me at the time," he said stiffly. "I had no knowledge of any journal. But your nephew's journal says you knew he was guilty, that you actively helped cover it up. That's not true." "I never—" Wallace's voice cracked. "I did what I thought was right for the school. By expelling an innocent student? The evidence pointed to him, but you knew it wasn't him. Your nephew confessed to you." Wallace's face went red. "I don't have to answer these questions. This was 20 years ago. I made the best decision I could with the information I had. Did you keep the $3,000 that your nephew mentions in his journal? The money he says you kept to donate to the school?" Wallace turned and went inside his house, slamming the door. The reporters kept filming, kept asking questions through the closed door, but he didn't come back out. Daniel watched the footage with Rita that evening. "He's still lying," Daniel said quietly. "Even now, with everything proven, he's still lying." "People like that don't admit they're wrong," Rita said. "It would mean facing what they did. That's too much for most people." The school district issued a formal apology 3 weeks after the backpack was found. They held a press conference with the current superintendent, a woman who hadn't even been working there in 2003. She read from a prepared statement about how Daniel had been treated unjustly, how the district deeply regretted the harm done, how policies had changed since then to ensure such mistakes wouldn't happen again. Daniel attended the press conference but didn't speak. He just stood there while the superintendent talked, while reporters snapped photos, while the district tried to control the narrative. Afterward, they offered him a settlement, a significant amount of money along with a full clearing of his record. "They want you to sign an NDA," the lawyer explained. Non-disclosure agreement. "Means you can't talk publicly about the details of the settlement or continue to speak negatively about the district." "No," Daniel said immediately. "I'm not staying quiet anymore. I stayed quiet for 20 years. The settlement would be substantial. Enough to change your life." Daniel thought about it. The money would be life-changing. He could expand his business, put Lucy through any college she wanted, buy his parents a better house. But it would mean giving up his voice right when people were finally listening. "What's the settlement without the NDA?" he asked. The lawyer named a figure that was less than half of what they'd originally offered. "I'll take it," Daniel said. "Without the NDA." Rita squeezed his hand. "You sure?" "I'm sure. This isn't about the money. It never was." The local news ran a special segment called 20 Years of Injustice, One Man's Story. They interviewed former classmates of Daniel's, teachers who remembered him, the police officers who'd originally investigated the case in 2003. One former teacher cried on camera, saying she'd always believed Daniel was innocent but hadn't spoken up at the time. "I should have fought harder for him," she said. "I should have demanded a real investigation. I failed him, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Dylan Wallace was harder to find. He'd moved to Florida years ago, worked as a car salesman, got married and divorced. When reporters finally tracked him down, he refused to comment at first. But the pressure kept building. His employer found out about his past. Local news in Florida picked up the story. Finally, he agreed to an interview. Daniel couldn't bring himself to watch it live. He read the transcript later. "I was a kid," Dylan had said. "I made a terrible mistake. I was scared and desperate, and I did something I've regretted every day since." "Did you know Daniel was expelled for something you did?" "Yes, and it's haunted me. But I was young and my uncle said he'd handle it and I trusted him. You never came forward. Not once in 20 years I was afraid. Afraid of jail. Afraid of disappointing my family. I know that's not an excuse. There is no excuse. What would you say to Daniel Chen if you could?" A long pause. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. Nothing I say could ever be enough. But I am truly, deeply sorry for what I did to him." Daniel read those words in his garage late at night, the printed transcript in his hands. Sorry. Dylan Wallace was sorry. The apology he'd imagined hearing for 20 years, and now that it was here, it felt hollow. Empty. What was sorry supposed to do? Give him back Stanford? Give him back his reputation? Give him back his parents' pride before they'd aged watching their son struggle? But something in him softened a tiny bit. Dylan had been 17 too, scared and stupid and making the worst decision of his life. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it made him human instead of just a villain. The district attorney filed charges. Dylan Wallace was arrested on theft charges and providing false information to law enforcement. The statute of limitations had run out on some charges, but not others. He faced up to 2 years in prison. Richard Wallace, the former principal, faced tougher charges. Obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, abuse of power. The DA was building a case that he'd actively covered up a crime and destroyed evidence. If convicted, he could face 5 years. Daniel was asked to attend the school board meeting where they would formally discuss Wallace's legacy. The board was considering stripping him of various honors, including his name on a plaque in the school. The meeting room was packed. Former students, parents, reporters, community members. Daniel sat in the front row with Rita on one side and his lawyer on the other. Lucy had wanted to come, but they'd decided she was still too young for this. One by one, people spoke. Some defended Wallace, talking about all the good he'd done over his career, how one mistake shouldn't erase 30 years of service. Others spoke about the harm done to Daniel, about the responsibility schools have to protect all students, about accountability. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he stood slowly. His legs felt shaky. He'd faced reporters, done interviews, but this felt different. More personal. These were people from his community, people who'd watched this story unfold. "I'm not here for revenge," Daniel said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "I'm here because I want people to understand what happened and why it matters." Principal Wallace made a choice 20 years ago. He chose to protect his nephew instead of finding the truth. He chose his family over justice. And I understand that impulse. Family is important. But he was in a position of power. He was supposed to protect all students, not just the ones he was related to. Daniel paused, gathering his thoughts. "I lost my scholarship. I lost my reputation. I lost years of my life to anger and shame and the weight of an accusation I couldn't disprove. But what I lost most was my faith in the system. I believed that if you worked hard, followed the rules, did everything right, you'd be okay. Principal Wallace taught me that wasn't true. That sometimes the system fails you, and there's nothing you can do about it." He looked around the room. "Until now. Finding that backpack, that journal, it gave me something I thought I'd never have. Proof. But more than that, it gave me my voice back. For 20 years I stayed quiet because I thought no one would believe me. Now people are listening. And what I want them to hear is this. We have to do better. Schools have to do better. We can't let fear of looking weak make us rush to judgment. We can't protect some students at the expense of others. And when we make mistakes, we have to own them." Daniel sat down. The room was silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping. Others joined in. Not everyone. Some people sat with their arms crossed, but enough that the sound filled the room. The school board voted that night. 7-2. They removed Richard Wallace's name from the plaque and revoked several honorary titles they'd given him over the years. It wasn't much, but it was something. An acknowledgement that what he'd done was wrong. The court cases moved slowly, as court cases always do. Dylan Wallace took a plea deal. He admitted to the theft and to providing false information. He was sentenced to 6 months in county jail and ordered to pay restitution to the school district and to Daniel personally. His lawyer had argued for community service only, but the judge wasn't having it. "You let an innocent young man take the fall for your crime for 2 decades," the judge said at sentencing. "That shows a profound lack of character and responsibility. You will serve time." Dylan looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit. He'd gained weight over the years, lost most of his hair. He wasn't the Golden Boy quarterback anymore. Just a middle-aged man facing the consequences of something he'd done half a lifetime ago. When asked if he wanted to address the court, Dylan had stood and turned to where Daniel sat in the gallery. "I know saying sorry isn't enough. I know I can't give you back what I took. But I am sorry, Daniel. I was a scared kid who made the worst choice possible, and you paid for it. I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Daniel had nodded once, acknowledging the apology without accepting it. Maybe someday he'd be able to forgive Dylan. But that day wasn't today. Richard Wallace's case was more complicated. His lawyers argued that he'd done nothing illegal, that he'd simply made an administrative decision based on available evidence. But the journal entries were damning. Dylan had written clearly that his uncle knew the truth and had actively worked to frame Daniel. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Witnesses testified about Wallace's character, about the school environment, about the investigation in 2003. Daniel was called to testify about what had happened to him, about the meeting in the principal's office, about the years that followed. "Did Principal Wallace ever reach out to you after your expulsion?" the prosecutor asked. "No," Daniel said. "Not once. Not in 20 years. Did he ever investigate further after expelling you?" "Not that I'm aware of. He made his decision and that was it. I was guilty, case closed." The defense tried to paint Daniel as bitter and vindictive, as someone looking for a payday after all these years. But it didn't land. The evidence was too clear and Daniel's testimony was too honest. He wasn't performing outrage. He was just telling the truth. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Richard Wallace guilty on 3 counts: obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and abuse of authority. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in a minimum security facility, followed by probation. He also lost his pension. When the verdict was read, Wallace had dropped his head into his hands. His wife, sitting behind him, had started crying. Daniel had watched from across the courtroom and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction exactly, but something close to it. Not because an old man was going to prison, but because someone had finally said officially, legally, that what happened to Daniel was wrong. After the trial, reporters swarmed Daniel on the courthouse steps. He gave a brief statement that his lawyer had helped him prepare, thanking the district attorney's office and the jury for their service. But mostly he just wanted to go home. The settlement money from the school district came through a month later. It wasn't enough to make him rich, but it was enough to change things. Daniel paid off his mortgage, put money aside for Lucy's college, and then did something he'd been thinking about for weeks. He established a scholarship fund. The Second Chance Scholarship, he called it. It would go to students who'd faced significant setbacks, who'd been wrongly accused of things, who'd had their educational paths disrupted through no fault of their own. The first year, he funded 3 full scholarships to community college. The second year, he hoped to do more. "You're giving away the settlement money?" Rita asked when he told her his plan. "Not all of it, but a lot of it, yeah. That money came from pain, from injustice. I want something good to come from it. I want kids who've been where I was to know that someone believes in them, that they still have a chance." Rita kissed him. "You're a good man, Daniel Chen." 6 months after the trials ended, Daniel received an unexpected letter. It was from Stanford University. They'd followed his story in the news and wanted to offer him something. Not admission, he was 40 years old, he'd moved past that dream, but an honorary recognition. They wanted him to speak at an event about resilience and justice, and they wanted to formally acknowledge that he should have been part of their class of 2007. Daniel held the letter with shaking hands. Rita read it over his shoulder. "Are you going to do it?" "I think so," Daniel said. "I think I need to." The event was held on a Saturday afternoon in October. Daniel flew out to California with Rita and Lucy. Walking onto the Stanford campus felt surreal. All those years ago, he'd imagined this moment so many times, walking these paths, sitting in these classrooms, being part of this community. Now he was here as a guest, as someone whose story had meaning, not because he'd attended, but because he hadn't been able to. The speech was in a small auditorium. About 200 people attended, mostly students and faculty, some people from the community who'd read about his story. Daniel stood at the podium and looked out at all those faces. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that everything happens for a reason," he began, "because I don't believe that. Some things just happen because people make bad choices, because systems fail, because life isn't fair. What happened to me didn't happen for a reason. It happened because a kid made a terrible choice and an adult in power chose to cover it up." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I can tell you what I learned from it. I learned that resilience isn't about bouncing back. It's about moving forward even when you're still hurt. It's about building a life even when the foundation you thought you had crumbles. I learned that truth matters even when it takes 20 years to come out. I learned that speaking up matters, even when you think no one's listening." Daniel told them about working construction, about starting his business, about meeting Rita and having Lucy, about therapy and learning to carry the weight of injustice without letting it crush him, about finding that backpack and finally having proof. "The vindication felt good," he said honestly. "I won't lie about that. Having people believe me, having the truth come out, it mattered. But it didn't give me back those 20 years. It didn't get me into this school. It didn't let me live the life I'd planned." He looked around the auditorium. "So what I want to tell all of you, especially those of you who are students here, is this. Cherish what you have. The opportunity to be here, to learn, to grow. Some of you might take it for granted. That's normal. But remember that for some people, this opportunity was stolen. And if you ever find yourself in a position of power, whether that's as a teacher, a boss, a parent, anyone who has influence over someone else's life, remember how much your choices matter, how one decision can change someone's entire trajectory." The audience was quiet, listening. Daniel continued, "And if you're someone who's faced injustice, who's been accused of something you didn't do, who's lost opportunities through no fault of your own, I want you to know that you can survive it. You can build a good life. It won't be the life you planned, but it can still be good. Don't let bitterness consume you. Don't let the injustice define you. Keep moving forward. Keep telling the truth, and know that sometimes, eventually, people listen." When he finished, the applause was immediate and thunderous. People stood. Daniel saw students wiping their eyes, professors nodding. After the speech, dozens of people came up to talk to him, to thank him for sharing his story, to tell him about injustices they'd faced. One young woman, maybe 19, waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching. "My brother was expelled from his high school for something he didn't do," she said quietly. "Your story gives me hope that someday people will believe him too." Daniel gave her his card. "Have him email me. Maybe the scholarship fund can help." Flying home, Lucy asleep against Rita's shoulder, Daniel looked out the airplane window at the clouds below. He thought about the boy he'd been, sitting in that principal's office, terrified and confused. He wished he could go back and tell that kid that he'd survive this, that it would be hard, harder than anything he'd ever faced, but that he'd make it through.